In a digital archive of the Children's Aid Society, I found a tintype from 1859. It shows a boy waiting for a train to the Midwest, labeled as a destitute street urchin. But when I zoomed in on the high-resolution scan, the official narrative collapsed. He is not wearing rags. He is wearing a tailored velvet suit and clutching a heavy gold pocket watch with white-knuckled terror. Street children do not own gold watches, and they certainly do not keep them in state custody. This was not a beggar. This was a displaced refugee wearing the clothes of a dead father. He is one of 250,000 children who were sold to bury the past. I did not begin this investigation with the intention of rewriting history. I certainly did not set out to question the origins of the American population or the fundamental timeline of the 19th century. My initial goal was entirely mundane, bordering on the tedious. I was conducting a comparative economic analysis of railroad solvency between 1850 and 1870. Specifically, I was trying to understand how the major rail companies of the East Coast maintained their liquidity before the industrial explosion of the post-Civil War era. The official economic models have always felt slightly off to me. The revenue per mile of track laid in the 1850s simply does not justify the colossal expense of the construction, at least not based on the freight manifests that have been preserved. I wanted to see the raw data. I wanted to see the passenger logs. I wanted to understand the break-even point of the early American locomotive industry. So, I started where any responsible researcher starts. I went to the ledgers. I accessed the digitized archives of the Mid-Atlantic rail lines, focusing on the non-revenue columns, the seats filled by passengers who did not pay a fare. In modern transit, this is usually railway staff or government officials. In 1854, I expected to see transit workers, perhaps soldiers moving between garrisons. What I found instead was a statistical anomaly so glaring that I initially assumed it was a transcription error. Column after column, page after page, month after month, the non-revenue seats were filled by a specific category of passenger. The clerks of the era had various shorthand codes for them: wards, fosters, placements, or simply supply. The sheer volume was staggering. We are not talking about a few dozen children moved for charity. We are talking about train cars, entire distinct manifest sheets, filled exclusively with unaccompanied minors. I pulled the data into a spreadsheet, thinking I could isolate the pattern and explain it away as a seasonal migration or a localized event. But the pattern refused to be isolated. From 1854 through the late 1860s, the movement of children from the eastern cities to the western interior wasn't a trickle. It was a flood. I ran the numbers against the census data for New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. I looked at the birth rates. I looked at the immigration influx. And then I looked at the mortality rates. This is where the ordinary research stopped and the obsession began, because the math does not work. Mainstream history tells us about the Orphan Train Movement. It frames it as a benevolent, if somewhat disorganized, welfare program designed to move street urchins from overcrowded cities to wholesome farm families in the Midwest. The number usually cited is 250,000 children over a 75-year period. That is the accepted figure. That is the figure you will find in textbooks and on commemorative plaques. But when you compress the bulk of that movement into the peak years of activity, as the train manifests suggest we must, you run into a biological impossibility. For there to be 250,000 surplus children, children completely untethered from family structures, available for immediate transport, there must be a corresponding mass casualty event among the adult population. Parents do not simply vanish. Even in the depths of Victorian poverty, family units cling together. For a population of orphans that size to exist, you need a mortality event akin to the Black Death. You need 500,000 dead parents in the span of a decade, localized entirely within the coastal cities. I checked the cholera outbreaks. I checked the tuberculosis wards, I checked the crime statistics. There were deaths, certainly. Life was hard. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing, in the mortality records of the 1850s that accounts for a sudden, massive surplus of unaccompanied children on this scale. The death curves are flat. The population curves are rising. And yet, the trains were full. I sat with those spreadsheets for 3 weeks. I tried to make the numbers fit the narrative. I tried to convince myself that maybe orphan was being used loosely, that perhaps these were just children sent ahead by living parents. But then, I found the surrender forms, the legal documents parents allegedly signed to give up their children. They were scarce, incredibly scarce. Most of these children were processed without a single signature from a biological relative. They simply appeared in the system. They were processed. They were loaded. They were gone. The logistical scale of it began to weigh on me. This wasn't charity work. Charity is messy, underfunded, and sporadic. This was efficient. This was industrial. The coordination required to move thousands of minors per month. Feed them, clothe them, and transport them thousands of miles requires a level of infrastructure that the charitable organizations of the era simply did not possess. It requires state-level logistics. It requires a supply chain. And that is the phrase that kept turning over in my mind as I looked at the columns of names. Supply chain. The railroads weren't just moving people. They were distributing a resource. The resource happened to be human. And the source of that resource was completely unaccounted for in the vital statistics of the time. The more I looked at the discrepancy, the more the official explanation felt like a thin veneer over something much older and much darker. I realized I couldn't rely on the spreadsheets anymore. The numbers were lying, or rather, they were recording the aftermath of a lie. I needed to see the cargo. I turned my attention to the photographic record. The Children's Aid Society and the New York Foundling Hospital were prolific in their documentation. They understood the power of the image long before modern advertising. They needed to sell the idea of these children to the families in the West, and they needed to solicit donations from the wealthy in the East. So, they took photographs. Thousands of them. I started downloading the highest resolution scans I could find from the Library of Congress and university archives. I wasn't looking for emotional impact. I was looking for material evidence. I wanted to see the poverty. I wanted to see the rags, the malnutrition, the undeniable signs of street urchin life that Dickens had primed us to expect. I opened a file from 1859. It was a tintype, remarkably preserved, showing a group of about 30 boys waiting on a platform, presumably in New York or New Jersey. The caption identified them as destitute boys for the West. I zoomed in. The grain of the image was sharp enough to see the texture of the fabric. And that was the first thing that stopped me. These destitute boys were wearing velvet. Not cheap cotton, not rough wool, but velvet. I checked the light hitting the lapels. The sheen was unmistakable. They were wearing silk cravats. Their coats were tailored, fitted at the waist, with distinct, high-quality buttons. I looked at their feet. In the lore of the orphan trains, the children are often described as shoeless or wearing oversized, cast-off boots. These children were wearing fitted leather boots with intricate stitching. I know a little about 19th century cobbling. Hand-stitched leather of that quality was not something you found in a donation bin. It was bespoke. It was expensive. I thought perhaps this is a staged photo, a propaganda piece where they dress the children up to make them look adoptable. That is the standard historian's dismissal. It was marketing. So I looked for the signs of staging. In a studio, the light is controlled. The shadows are consistent. But in this photo, the light was harsh, coming from the open side of the depot. The shadows were deep and angular. This was a candid shot in a transit hub. And then I looked at the faces. You can dress a starving child in a velvet suit, but you cannot hide the malnutrition in their bones. I looked for rickets. I looked for the sunken cheeks of famine. I looked for the dull eyes of vitamin deficiency. These children were robust. They were healthy. Their faces were full. But their expressions were not the expressions of children who have been rescued. They were the expressions of children who have been traumatized. They looked terrified, confused, and utterly out of place. They didn't look like beggars who had just been given a warm coat. They looked like princes who had been kidnapped. I moved to another image, dated 1862. A group of girls this time. Same anomaly. Lace collars. Intricate embroidery on the hems of their dresses. One girl was holding a doll that, even in the black and white grit of the tintype, was clearly porcelain with real hair. A luxury item. I began to cross-reference these images with known photographs of actual slum dwellers from the same period. When Jacob Riis later photographed the slums of New York, he captured the reality of poverty. Rags, dirt, filth, exhaustion. The visual language of the Orphan Train photos is diametrically opposed to the visual language of the slums. They are two different worlds. The children on the trains do not look like they came from the tenements. They look like they came from the drawing rooms of the upper class. I spent days analyzing the fabric weaves. I learned about the textile manufacturing of the 1850s. The patterns I was seeing, complex plaids, brocades, fine wools, were machine-made but expensive. They belonged to the class of people who owned the factories, not the people who worked in them. So, if they weren't street urchins, who were they? I found a photo where a boy, perhaps 7 years old, is holding a pocket watch. He is clutching it with a white-knuckled grip, as if he is afraid someone is going to take it away. I zoomed in on the chain. It was a heavy, double-linked chain, likely gold. A street child in 1859 would have sold that watch for food within an hour of finding it. A street child would not be allowed to keep it in an asylum. The only reason a 7-year-old boy has a gold pocket watch on a train platform is if it is the last thing he has left of his father. The time frame of these anomalous photos clusters tightly. The most jarring images, the ones with the most obvious wealth displayed on the Orphans, appear between 1854 and 1865. After 1870, the photos change. The children start looking poorer. The clothes look rougher. It suggests that whatever source population these first waves of children were drawn from, it was finite. It was exhausted within a decade. The high-quality orphans were shipped out first. I tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe these were the children of wealthy families who died in an epidemic. But again, the wealthy don't just die leaving no trace. They have wills. They have estates. They have extended networks of kin who take the children in. The wealthy do not surrender their heirs to the Children's Aid Society to be shipped to a pig farm in Nebraska, unless the extended kin were also dead, unless the estates were gone, unless the entire social strata they belonged to had been wiped off the map. This brought me to the second cluster of evidence, and perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire investigation, the institutional handling of the parent gap. In any investigation, silence is often louder than noise. The things that are not in the archives are usually more important than the things that are. I began to search for the paperwork that should exist. If you have 250,000 children, you should have 500,000 death certificates, or at least a paper trail of surrender. I contacted archives. I scoured the digitized records of the New York municipal government. I looked for the intake logs of the major asylums. I found them, but they were remarkably empty of detail. Entry after entry listed the child's name, often noted as given name or new name, an approximate age, and under the column for parentage or family history, the same words repeated over and over. Unknown, foundling, street, none. It is easy to accept this if you believe the street urchin narrative, but I had the photos of the velvet suits burned into my retinas. These children knew who they were. A 7-year-old boy in a silk cravat knows his last name. He knows his father's profession. He knows his address. So why does the record say unknown? This is where the pattern of passive erasure becomes visible. It is not that the information was lost. It appears to have been deliberately not recorded. The institutions of the mid-19th century were bureaucratic machines. They counted everything. They tracked every penny spent on coal for the orphanage furnaces. They tracked the weight of the bread served at dinner. The idea that they simply forgot to ask a coherent 7-year-old boy who his parents were is not credible. The silence feels professional. It feels like a policy. I looked at how modern historians handle this. When I read the academic literature on the orphan trains, I found a distinct lack of curiosity about the origins of the children. The focus is entirely on the adventure of the West, the success stories of children who became governors or farmers. The parent gap is dismissed with vague gestures toward generic hardship or the chaos of immigration. They categorize the children as social welfare success stories. Once you categorize something, you stop investigating it. If you file a document under philanthropy, you do not look for evidence of trauma or abduction. The categorization protects the silence. I found a reference in a digitized journal from a social worker in the 1890s, a retrospective on the early days of the movement. She noted, almost in passing, that the early transports were often confused about their station and required firm re-education regarding their new lot in life. Confused about their station. That is a polite Victorian way of saying these children did not believe they were beggars. They believed they were something else. And the firm re-education? That implies a systematic breaking of the will. The placing out forms were the legal instrument of this erasure. I managed to find copies of these contracts. They were essentially deeds of transfer. The family in the West, the foster family, was given total control. The child was often required to take the new family's name. The contract explicitly forbade the biological parents, if they were ever found, from contacting the child. It was a hermetic seal. It was designed not just to move the child, but to sever the timeline. Why? If this was charity, why the secrecy? If this was about saving children, why destroy their past? The incentives for this silence in the present day are obvious. To acknowledge that 250,000 American ancestors were not saved from the streets, but potentially trafficked from a fallen society, would require rewriting the entire demographic history of the United States. It is easier to stick with the street urchin myth. It is comfortable. It fits the Horatio Alger story of pulling oneself up by the bootstraps. But the silence of the archives forced me to look for evidence that couldn't be shredded or omitted. I stopped looking at paper and started looking at brick and mortar. I turned my attention to the buildings where these children were held before they were shipped out. The asylums. If you want to understand the scale of an operation, you look at its infrastructure. In the 1850s, there was a sudden explosion of charitable construction. Massive orphanages, asylums, and homes for the friendless appeared in New York, Boston, Ohio, and all the way out to the frontier. I focused on a few specific sites: the New York Juvenile Asylum, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, which housed children as well, the enormous, fortress-like orphanages of St. Louis. I didn't just look at pictures. I looked at the blueprints. I looked at the measurements. And once again, the physical reality clashed with the official narrative. I traveled to one of the surviving structures in Ohio, a massive red brick complex now used as administrative offices. I stood in the main hallway. The first thing that hits you is the scale. It is oppressive. I took out my tape measure. The doorway to the main dormitory measured 12 feet in height. The doorknob, the original brass fixture, was situated nearly 5 feet off the ground. I am a grown man, and I have to reach slightly up to grab it. For a child, for a 6-year-old ward of the state, it would be physically impossible to turn that knob without standing on a box. I walked up the main staircase. The risers, the vertical part of the step, were nearly 12 inches high. Standard modern stairs are around 7 inches. A 12-inch riser is exhausting for an adult. For a child, it is a climbing wall. I walked through the corridors. They were 14 feet wide. You could drive a truck through them. Why? Why waste that much space, that much material, that much heating capability? For a charity building designed to warehouse poor children? The official explanation is Victorian grandeur. We are told that the architects of the era wanted to inspire awe and moral rectification through architecture. But form follows function, and the function of these buildings does not match the physiology of their inhabitants. I went to the basement. I looked at the foundation stones. They were limestone blocks the size of compact cars. The precision of the masonry was absolute. No mortar gaps, perfect geometry. I calculated the weight of the material. I calculated the labor required to quarry, transport, and set this stone in 1855, using horse-drawn wagons and manual pulleys. Then, I looked at the funding records. These buildings were supposedly funded by private donations and state grants. I ran the inflation conversions. The cost to build the New York Juvenile Asylum in today's dollars, using the methods available then, would be in the billions. The donations listed in the annual reports amount to a pittance. The math of the construction is just as broken as the math of the population. There is a theory, one that I was initially skeptical of, that suggests these buildings were not built for the orphans. They were found. They were remnants, survivors of the event that created the orphans in the first place. The asylums were simply the few large structures left standing and habitable after the reset. They were repurposed. This explains the scale mismatch. The buildings were built by a civilization that built larger. The doors were made for people, or beings, who were comfortable with 12-foot clearances. The stairs were designed for a longer stride. The orphanage was just a label slapped onto a repurposed ruin. This hypothesis explains why the heating systems in these buildings are often so nonsensical. Fireplaces that are too small for the room volume, or steam pipes that seem to be retrofitted crudely into walls that weren't designed for them. It looks like a squatting operation. We were squatting in the ruins of the past, and we filled those ruins with the children who survived. I started mapping these asylums. I placed a pin on a digital map for every major orphanage built between 1850 and 1860. The pattern that emerged was not random. It followed the rail lines perfectly. But more importantly, it followed a specific band of geography, a corridor stretching from New York through Ohio, Indiana, and into Missouri. This corridor contains the highest density of Romanesque red brick architecture in the country. It also contains the highest density of orphan train depots. I zoomed in on the maps themselves, and this is where the erasure moves from passive to active. This is where I saw the deliberate modification of the record. I began comparing maps from 1845 with maps from 1860. I used the Library of Congress digital collection, overlaying them layer by layer. In 1845, in a town in Ohio, there is a large structure labeled Public Lyceum, or simply Community Hall. In 1860, that same footprint, that same exact building, is relabeled State Asylum for the Insane, or Home for Friendless Children. The function changed, but the building remained, and in many cases, the surrounding town did not. I found instances of what I call ghost cities. In early daguerreotypes from the 1850s, you can find panoramic shots of cities like Cincinnati or St. Louis. If you look closely at the edges of the frame, you see dense urban sprawl, spires, domes, massive factories. But the streets are empty. There are no people. There are no horses. There is no smoke coming from the chimneys. Then, 5 years later, the trains arrive. The orphans arrive. And suddenly, the city is boomtown. The official history tells us that the West was settled by pioneers in covered wagons. But the architectural evidence suggests that the West was resettled. The infrastructure was there, the housing was there, the factories were there. They were just empty. and they needed a labor force small enough to navigate the tunnels, numerous enough to clear the mud, and traumatized enough not to ask questions about where the previous inhabitants went. I kept digging into the cartographic data. I started looking for place names that vanished. There is a period, roughly 1840 to 1850, that acts as a black hole for census data in certain counties in the Midwest. The records simply stop. When they resume in 1855 or 60, the names of the families are different. The names of the towns are often anglicized or simplified. It was during this comparison that I found a reference in a gazetteer from 1848. It listed a town in Missouri with a population of 4,000, known for its mineral springs and stone baths. In the 1860 gazetteer, that town is listed as a settlement of 200 people. The stone baths are not mentioned, but an orphan asylum sits on the same coordinates. The erasure was not just of people, it was of culture. I was deep in this map comparison, feeling the vertigo that comes when you realize the ground you are standing on is not the ground of history, but a layer of filled dirt over something else. When I realized I needed to check the newspapers. Not the big city papers. They were controlled, edited, sanitized. I needed the small-town rags, the local weeklies that printed gossip and shipping news. I needed to see what the people on the ground saw when the trains pulled in. The mainstream narrative says the arrival of the orphan trains was a joyous, charitable event. But I suspected the local farmers saw something else. I suspected they saw the anomaly just as clearly as I did, even if they didn't have the words to describe it. But the maps were only the beginning of what disappeared. As I turned my attention to the contemporary reports, the silence of the archives gave way to a chorus of whispers that had been ignored for 150 years. And what those whispers described was not a welfare program. It was an invasion. I started pulling the microfilm for small-town publications from Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri. The Missouri Republican, the Iowa State Register, the Oskaloosa Herald. I focused on the years 1855 to 1875, searching for keywords like train, orphans, foundlings, and New York. The tone of these articles was the first thing that struck me. In modern retellings, the arrival of the orphans is treated with a kind of sepia-tone sentimentality. We imagine tearful reunions and kindly farmers looking for a son. But the journalism of the era was brutally pragmatic. The reports did not read like human interest stories. They read like cargo manifests. A fresh load of labor arrived yesterday. One article from an 1859 Illinois paper read, 50 head of stock and 30 children delivered to the station. The stock is in fair condition. The children are slight but appear unbroken. Unbroken. That is a term you use for horses, not human beings. Another report from Iowa, 1861. The distribution of New York paupers took place at the depot at noon. Farmers are advised to inspect the teeth and limbs before signing the indenture. No returns will be accepted after 48 hours. This wasn't adoption. This was an auction. The children were lined up on the platforms, sometimes on boxes, so they would appear taller, and the local farmers would prod their muscles, check their teeth, and look for signs of disease. The matter-of-fact tone of the reporting is chilling. There was no moral outrage. It was treated as a standard economic transaction. A supply drop from the east to the resource-hungry west. But buried within these callous reports, I began to find the anomalies. The cracks in the facade where the true nature of these children leaked through. I found a strange little blurb in a Missouri paper from 1862. It described a wild child who had been placed with a local blacksmith. The article noted that the boy, approximately 8 years old, refused to speak English. That, in itself, wasn't uncommon for immigrants. But the report went on to say that the boy spoke a strange tongue that the local priest could not identify, despite knowing Latin and Greek. The boy reportedly spent his time drawing intricate diagrams in the dust, pictures of towers falling in water, and machines that the reporter described as wheels within wheels. The article treated it as a curiosity, a bit of local color about the madness of the city children. But to me, it read like a fragment of a memory of the event that had orphaned him. I found another report from 1865 in Kansas. A farmer complained to the local magistrate that the 3 boys he had taken in were useless for the plow, but had managed to repair a complex steam thresher that had been broken for years. The farmer was suspicious. He claimed the boys possessed unnatural knowledge of mechanics, but did not know how to milk a cow. These fragments appear repeatedly. Children who play the violin with concert-level skill, but have no name. Children who can perform complex mathematical calculations in their heads, but don't know the Bible. Children who are terrified of rain, or thunder, or the sound of rushing water. The contemporary reports paint a picture of a population that was highly educated, skilled, and traumatized, being forcibly integrated into a primitive agricultural society. It was a cultural lobotomy. The skills of the old world, the world of the velvet suits and the pocket watches, were useless in the mud of the frontier. So they were beaten out of them. And then, abruptly, the reporting changes. By 1880, the tone shifts. The strange tongues are no longer mentioned. The unnatural knowledge disappears from the record. The articles become standardized, praising the sturdy pioneer spirit of the adoptees. The anomaly was smoothed over by the passage of time. The children grew up. They forgot. Or they learned that remembering was dangerous. The reports stop, but the physical evidence does not. I knew that paper could be burned and memories could be repressed. But objects, hard, physical artifacts, are harder to erase. I began to search for the material legacy of the orphan trains. I looked at what was found in the trunks and attics of the families who descended from these riders. I scoured estate sale listings, museum catalogs, and the back rooms of historical societies in the Midwest. I was looking for the items the children brought with them. The official story is that they brought nothing, maybe a small bundle of rags. But the artifacts tell a different story. I found lockets, dozens of them, intricate goldwork, far superior to the jewelry commonly available to the working class of the 1850s. Inside these lockets were not photos of poor immigrants in line at Ellis Island. They were photos of dignified adults, standing in front of pillared buildings with domes. The women wore pearls. The men wore frock coats. These were not the faces of people who abandoned their children because they couldn't afford bread. These were the faces of the people who ran the world before the bottom fell out. I found toys. Cast-iron mechanical toys found in the luggage of orphans. I examined a small, clockwork train engine attributed to a rider from 1857. The machining was precise. The tolerances were tight. It was a piece of engineering that suggested a high-tech society, not a handmade wooden trinket. And then there were the tools. This is the evidence that connects the children directly to the architecture. I found child-sized shovels, picks, and hammers in the collections of several Midwestern museums. They are often labeled as educational replicas or toys. I went to a museum in Nebraska that had a collection of these items. I asked to see them. I put on gloves and held a child's shovel. It was heavy. It was forged from high-quality steel, not tin, and the handle was worn smooth by sweat and grit. I looked at the blade. It was eroded. It had strike marks. It had been used to dig, not in a sandbox, in clay, in rock. Why manufacture industrial-grade tools for 6-year-olds? Why create thousands of them? The answer lay in the geography. These tools appear in the same towns where the ghost cities stood, the towns that needed to be dug out. The Mudflood theory posits that the reset involved a massive inundation of soil that buried the lower levels of the infrastructure. If you have a city half buried in mud, and you have tunnels and basements that need to be cleared, who fits in the tight spaces? Who can be sent into the unstable ruins to recover the technology or clear the foundations? You don't send a grown man if the tunnel is 3 feet wide. You send a child with a shovel, a child who has no parents to complain if the tunnel collapses. The wear patterns on those tools are the fingerprints of the crime. They prove that these children were not just farm labor. They were the excavation crew for the new civilization. This brings us to the unifying hypothesis, the single framework that makes all the anomalies, the velvet suits, the missing parents, the giant asylums, the strange skills, the industrial tools, fit together. What if the Orphan Train Movement was not a welfare program at all? What if it was a redistribution of survivors following a mid-century cataclysm? Consider the possibility that in the mid-19th century, a massive event occurred. A reset. Whether it was war, geological upheaval, or something else, it wiped out the adult population of the urban centers and buried the infrastructure of the continent. The survivors were the children. Perhaps they were smaller, easier to shelter, or simply biologically more resilient. They were left in the ruins of the cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia. They were wearing the clothes of their dead parents. They were clutching the heirlooms of their fallen families. The authorities, the inheritors who took control after the dust settled, were faced with a problem. They had a massive population of traumatized children who remembered the old world. They remembered the technology. They remembered the history. And they were clustered in the cities, a potential threat to the new narrative being written. So they had to be broken up. They had to be scattered. The asylums were not built for them. They were the surviving fortresses of the old world, hastily repurposed as processing centers. The charities were the logistical arm of the new regime. The trains were the mechanism of dispersal. By moving the children to the frontier, the controllers accomplished two things. First, they shattered the collective memory. A child alone in a cornfield in Iowa forgets the truth faster than a child surrounded by 10,000 others in New York. They severed the tribal bonds. They erased the lineage. Second, they provided the labor force necessary to dig out the West. The pioneers didn't build the cities of the plains from scratch. They excavated them, and the orphans were the engine of that excavation. This hypothesis explains the parent gap. The parents were dead. It explains the velvet suits. They were refugees, not beggars. It explains the indenture forms. It was a transfer of ownership. It explains the re-education. They had to forget the Latin and learn the plow. It explains why the West developed so impossibly fast in the late 1800s. It wasn't development. It was recovery. Now, I must address the counter-explanations. A reasonable mind seeks the path of least resistance. The strongest counter-argument is simply that immigration and disease created a poverty crisis. We are told that the Irish potato famine and the European revolutions sent millions of destitute people to America, and the mortality rate among them was high. I accept that poverty existed, but poverty does not create the material culture I found in the photographs. Poverty does not weave silk. Poverty does not cast gold watch chains. And poverty does not teach a child to draw diagrams of towers falling in water. The immigration theory explains the numbers, perhaps, but it fails to explain the artifacts. The second counterargument is that the records were simply lost due to incompetence or fire. The courthouse fire is the favorite excuse of every genealogist who hits a dead end. But we are talking about a systematic absence across dozens of states and hundreds of institutions. Bureaucracies of the 19th century were obsessive about debt and death. They tracked every penny. The idea that they lost the death records for 500,000 parents, specifically and exclusively the parents of these transportees, is statistically impossible. Random data loss looks like Swiss cheese, holes here and there. This looks like a censored document, entire blocks blacked out. The counter-explanations feel incomplete because they ignore the physical evidence. They ask us to trust the narrative over the architecture. They ask us to trust the textbook over the toolware. I cannot prove the reset happened. I cannot show you the smoking gun of the event itself. The paper trail has been burned. The names have been changed. The graveyards, if they exist, are unmarked. But the hypothesis of the reset offers a coherence that the mainstream narrative lacks. It treats the evidence as functional, not decorative. It respects the physics of the buildings and the biology of the population. However, even with this hypothesis, there are things that remain genuinely uncertain. I do not know who the agents were, the men in the dark suits who met the trains. They appear in the photos, standing at the edges watching. They don't look like farmers. They don't look like social workers. They look like wardens. And I do not know what happened to the children who were rejected. The reports mention that not all children were taken. Some were too weak or too strange. They were put back on the train. Where did they go? The records stop. The investigation leaves me not with answers, but with a profound sense of pressure. The weight of 250,000 lives. That number is not just a statistic. It is a genetic bottleneck. It represents a break in the human lineage. If these children were indeed the survivors of a reset, then we, the modern population of this country, are the descendants of the traumatized. We are the children of the memory wipe. I look at the photo of the boy with the pocket watch one last time. I wonder if he kept it. I wonder if he buried it in a field in Nebraska, hiding it from his new family. I wonder if he whispered the truth to his children, or if he let the silence swallow him whole to protect them. The questions that remain are hard ones. If these children were truly unwanted street beggars, why was so much money, so much coal, so much logistical power spent to move them? Governments do not spend fortunes moving the worthless. They move the valuable. What was the value? Why do the photos show terror and finery instead of hunger and rags? And who were the people holding the clipboards at the train stations, checking off names that had been invented hours before? We may never know the full truth of what happened in the mid-19th century. The mud has been paved over. The asylums have been turned into condos or administrative centers. The tools are rusting in museum basements, mislabeled and ignored. But the eyes in the tintypes are still watching. They are waiting for us to notice that their clothes don't fit the story. They told us they were building a new world. But looking at these faces, I think they were just burying the old one.